Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us at the Bloomberg Sustainable Business Summit. My name is Jillian Goodman. I'm an editor on Bloomberg Green, our climate change focused publication. And today we're talking about building a just transition. With me, I have Brandon Dennison, the founder and CEO of Coalfield Development, Suzanne DiBianca, the Chief Impact Officer, and the Executive Vice President of Corporate Relations at Salesforce, and Peggy Shepard, co-founder and Executive Director of We Act for Environmental Justice. Thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to start this panel by devoting a little bit of time to the idea, the definition of a just transition, because it's a little bit of it's a weird term. It's not a term that, many, I think, outside this conversation are necessarily super familiar with. So I think the transition piece of this is pretty obvious in that we're talking about transitioning to a zero carbon, zero greenhouse gas global economy. But how justice plays into that is much more complicated. I mean, obviously, transitioning to a zero carbon economy will render entire job categories, entire industries useless, invalid. And there are people associated with that, people with lives who drive their livelihoods from those industries. And so the idea of a just transition is making sure that we can move the economy forward into a future without these sort of harmful emissions in a way that doesn't leave a lot of people in the dust. And so, I know that you each have very different perspectives on, what a just transition looks like and just sort of what a just transition is. So I wanted to give you each a little bit of time to talk about that. Brandon, why don't we start with you?
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity. I think for me, it's about justice. It's justice, the root of the word justice. So these are the communities that have really powered the development of this country. Most anybody who's turned on a light switch was able to do that because of coal, the steel that has gone to build bridges and buildings. You don't have steel without coal. Much of that, mined right here in Appalachia. I'm based in West Virginia. So for me, it's not just about helping people to survive, sort of sharing, some of the breadcrumbs, but really putting these communities in the lead and making sure that people and communities are whole. And the theory of change for me and my organization, which is called Coalfield Development, is that actually a lot of the skills that are going to be needed to remediate and reclaim and retool our national economy, people in energy communities have those skills. And so my vision is actually that the communities that are going to be hurt by this transition could actually garner the investment needed to take the lead in the transition.
Mm-hmm. Peggy, what about you?
Yeah, I believe that a just transition refers to shifting from an economy run on fossil fuels, which are the cause of climate change, to one that's powered by renewable energy. And it really needs to be a transformative economic development strategy that works for all communities and diverse workers. And to make this transition just, we need to ensure that workers in the fossil fuel industry are retrained for a pipeline to clean energy jobs that are family sustaining, and that communities of color are prioritized for renewable energy projects and infrastructure, for decarbonization and electrification, energy and sustainability measures, and are really available for the new clean jobs that will be created.
Mm-hmm. And now, Suzanne, you come at this from a very different perspective, I think, from your position at Salesforce. When you are thinking about the idea of a just transition, like, where does that take you?
Yeah, thank you. It's COVID has been this has been such a crazy year. I think it's pulled the curtain up on so many issues around inequality, around climate, around leadership, around public health. And, as I think about what does a just transition mean, I mean, there's two things that I'll just sort of underline. One is I was very surprised when I started to work in climate a few years ago at Salesforce that it looks a lot like tech. It shocked me, actually. It looks almost identical to all the meetings that I'm in when I'm in a girl who grew up in technology. It's a very similar makeup. So I'm not seeing really a tapestry of people working on these issues in a way that I think needs to be there. So we've been working with the World Economic Forum on a program called Uplink, and really focusing on ecopreneurs. We're seeing this rise of ecopreneurs, but we're really focused on underrepresented minorities, young people, and making sure that the people working on these issues actually represent the society that we live in and that will be impacted in. And then the second thing I'll just underscore is, we launched an initiative called atrillion-trees.org, where we know that nature-based solutions are going to be critical in the climate crisis. And we partnered with American Forests, an incredible organization out of Washington, D.C., who's just launched something called a tree equity score. In other words, if you look at urban landscapes, you'll see deserts. There is no nature in many underserved communities. And not only is it going to deal with the climate crisis, it also cools those cities. It cleans the air. So when we think about where should a trillion trees go, in addition to big swaths of land, for example, in Canada and Brazil that we need to frankly conserve, we're very focused on tree equity in urban neighborhoods for a number of reasons.
Well, and Peggy, you also brought up the diversity aspect and the racial justice aspect of this. And you are obviously someone who's been working in this space and addressing that question for a long time at We Act for Environmental Justice. I'm just pulling up your bio because I'm trying to remember the name of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. You are currently the co-chair of that. And so, I wanted to talk a bit about, the work you're doing there. And kind of the moment we're in generally, not just in the US, where, we're in the middle of this large conversation about what the federal government can do for infrastructure, but also globally, you see the EU tomorrow planning to release a huge slate of environmental regulations aimed at getting us towards a net zero economy. That also includes a just transition fund. And so, Peggy, I'm wondering, what do you think we need to do in the US to make sure, what can we do, I suppose, with the levers that we have in the U.S. to make sure that that happens, that just transition happens here?
Well, we've got to pass the American Jobs Act, a really, really robust infrastructure bill that's being debated right now. And of course, the Justice 40 commitment by the Biden administration would ensure that 40% of the benefits of energy investments flow to frontline communities that have been disinvested in over the last decades. So really beginning to make those kinds of investments in the infrastructure that this country needs and that our communities need. We also have to invest in reducing legacy pollution that's currently exacerbated by the extreme weather events from climate change. So we've really got to reinvest in community resilience, sustainability, and community infrastructure. And really understand that there is a real interdisciplinary nature of these issues, whether it's the impact of transportation access, food quality access. All of these issues really combine together to determine whether we have sustainable and resilient communities or not. So that kind of investment is so critical because our communities are in such dire need. And as we see more wildfires, flooding, extreme heat, we've got to make those investments in order to begin to address these issues and assure that we have a healthy population that is resilient and that we can get back to a working economy after this COVID pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Well, and speaking of the interconnected nature of all of the changes we're going to need to make, that reminds me of something, Brandon, you said when we actually were chatting before this panel, talking about the complexity of needing to not just retrain workers, but also develop new businesses, invest in new businesses at the same time. and that, the one can't really happen without the other because, either we have workers without jobs or businesses without workers. So can you, I guess, like, tell us a little bit more about your work in that regard, to make sure both of those things are actually happening, and what kind of support do you feel like you need in order to, like, help that process along?
Yeah, the transition it's urgent that it does happen, because I agree. I mean, obviously, it's right in front of our faces how urgent the climate crisis is, and yet this just transition, I think, is easier said than done. I think a lot of times in conversations about just transition, we underestimate just how difficult this is. We coal communities here in West Virginia, the entire economy has been built around this industry for several generations. The financing system, the transportation systems, the education and workforce systems built around this one massive industry. And so to just turn that on a dime, that's what we need to do, and yet it's tough to do, and it should not be underestimated. A lot of times conversations about just transition center on retraining programs, and retraining is critical, but we're seeing there's a lot of pessimism about retraining here in West Virginia, because the problem is you can get the best training in the world, but it doesn't matter if there's not actually a job at the end of that training process that can pay you a decent wage, give you pride and dignity, and help you feed your family and pay your mortgage. And so what we do at Coalfield Development, it is training and retraining, but we also start the new businesses themselves. We call them social enterprises, so that the training and the actual paid employment can happen together at the same time. That starts to develop new markets and gain some economic traction. It's a more expensive way, frankly, to do job retraining, but it's also a much more effective way. And so when we look at this infrastructure bill and we say, how can that truly be helpful to Appalachia? There needs to be money, not just for retraining, but for the actual new businesses that are going to need to replace the coal industry and actually finally diversify our economy here.
Mm-hmm. Well, and, Suzanne, this is also, I know that Salesforce has a workforce development program and is trying to bring new people in. You spoke about the similarities you were seeing between, like, tech industry conversations and climate conversations. Obviously, the tech industry has struggled with diversity, struggled to bring in different populations. And now, as Brandon said, there are people who worry basically that this transition away from coal, from oil, means a transition away from the kind of economy where they can work. And so I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about, what you've learned from this workforce development program, and also, how you see the scale of the transition that's necessary and how businesses can respond to it.
Absolutely. First of all, I agree with Peggy on the Green Jobs, or on the Jobs Act that we have to get passed. And I just connect the dots to something that Brandon said, working in the coal industry. We have a platform called Trailhead, which is our free online learning platform. And one of my favorite stories, there's been so many, 3 million people have gone through this free online training program. And more than half have found a new job, starting wages at about $100,000 a year. One of my favorite stories is a guy named Zach, who's 3 generations in the coal industry, who reskilled on Trailhead. I'd actually love to have him maybe come talk to some of the folks that you work with, Brandon. Just an incredibly powerful story of this transition out of that industry into the tech industry, and what that took for him. And so we're seeing it all over, and I believe that it's not only a living wage is possible, but a good salary is possible. And, one area of focus for us has been on military veterans. And during the pandemic, twice the amount of military veterans or their spouses lost their jobs. And so what we've learned is you can train people all day long, but if you don't have that first job experience, it's very hard to get employed. So we worked with Hiring Our Heroes, great organization, and we paid for fellowships, 3-month fellowships that actually gave people job experience. 100% of them were hired at the end of their at the end of their tenure. And now we have this incredible ecosystem of partners. So we've now broadened it out to over 400 of our partners who are paying directly for fellowships. And they're often taking on these trained tech men and women right after their fellowship ends because they're desperate for talent. So we're kind of looking at, where can we pilot things and then scale out through our ecosystem. And the last shout out I'll do, because I just love this program, is Year Up. It's an incredible program founded out of Boston, working with underserved youth, 18 to 25, training them up in all kinds of skills. We've brought in thousands now. It's really helped with our diversity goals at Salesforce. They are very high performing talent, and they stay almost twice as long as our general population. So I think there's a lot of places to look that you can get diverse talent, but you got to stay committed to not only doing the training but supporting the work experience.
We have a question from the audience that I think is really interesting that I'm hoping actually both Brandon and Suzanne can speak to. Someone asks, do you find that older employees can adapt and develop new skills? Because I think this speaks to a very particular anxiety that a lot of people have who are in the middle or later stages of their career when they say, I've been building internal combustion engines for 40 years. Like, how am I going to adapt? So I don't, whichever of you wants to go first, but.
It certainly is possible. We've seen it happen. So of the different businesses we've started, we helped start the first solar company in our community, sustainable agriculture company, green manufacturing, green collar construction. And we use what we call our 33, 6, and 3 model. This is how we organize the work week: 33 hours of paid work, 6 hours of higher education, and 3 hours of personal development. So for that higher ed, we had a 53-year-old coal miner who became the first person in his family to earn a degree of higher education. And I remember, a conversation with him in our high tunnel about some of the readings that he was doing and how inspiring that was. So it is possible. I will say, we do see a bit of a generational divide, though, that, someone who's had the same career for 20, 30 years, that is asking a lot to totally retool the work that you do, quite possibly, for less money in too many instances that it has been less money. Whereas a lot of our enrollment is larger among younger, sort of 35 and below than 35 and above, but it is possible.
Mm-hmm. And Suzanne, have you had many older students come through these programs?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the question is, can you teach an old dog a new trick? I think you can. I'm learning about venture capital. I don't have a finance background. I'm not, I'm sort of experimenting with I didn't know anything about climate 4 years ago. And so I think that I agree with Brandon that many of these programs are targeted at a younger population. We don't find that so much in the veteran community. So I really like working in that community because you get people of all ages, all backgrounds, all, genders, races. And so, I've definitely seen success in an older population, particularly with that group. I think we have to just be very careful as employers to not be biased in any way. And people think bias means race or gender, but age is really critical. And so we really hold that as important, as dear. And so when we look at our own hiring and we look at placement within the ecosystem, we try to filter for all bias, including age. So I believe you can teach an old dog a new trick. I think that, there should be more programs that are focused on older adults looking for career transitions. And I'm certainly happy to support any of those as we see them come about.
Well, so Peggy, we've been talking about coal country. I brought up manufacturing, but your organization is headquartered in Manhattan. So we're talking about a whole other population that will also be affected by these changes. Earlier, you brought up communities that are also victims of pollution, victims of some of the, polluting practices that we've seen in the last, 100 years. And so I'm hoping you can talk about how this just transition can help communities who maybe aren't seeing quite the level of job transition, or maybe they are, but how what the ripple effects will be across other populations that maybe aren't quite so directly affected?
Yeah, a transition from a fossil fuel community, fossil fuel economy is going to have so many ripples. It's a comprehensive change in all aspects of our culture and society. Just as technology has transformed the way we do our work. When I first started as a reporter, I used a typewriter. A lot of people on this call probably have never used a typewriter. I would telegram people when we did our first campaign. We telegrammed the governor to ask him about a key issue. Right now, during COVID, if we didn't have access to broadband, our economy would be in shambles. So this transition from a fossil fuel economy is going to be as transformative as our new technology has been. And so we can't leave people behind. In many of the frontline communities, we're not even talking about a job transition. Many of those folks don't have a job. And so we've really got to think about new types of worker cooperatives and worker associations. We don't have unions all around this country. And in some cities, some of our folks who are Black and Brown have a hard time getting into a union. So, how do we really think about new kinds of worker associations? How do we think about microgrids that will begin to protect communities from blackouts as we begin to move towards electrification? How do we think more about solar energy jobs as a way to keep housing affordable? In a city like New York City, where probably 80% of folks are renters, we've really got to think about how we keep housing affordable. And reducing energy costs is a way to do that. So, solar, wind energy, we've really got to be much more innovative when we think about how we're going to ensure that this new energy transition does not increase energy insecurity, because we already know that there are 30 million households in this country that are already energy insecure, cannot pay that energy bill. Instead of, they might need to pay rent or medical bills. So the energy insecurity is already here. And as we transition, we may see an increase in those costs. And how do we begin to address that for the most vulnerable communities? And so I think when we think about the priorities of the new White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, a lot of the recommendations that have already been made, and there have been over 100 pages of those recommendations, so you can go on the EPA website and find them. But they're really recommendations looking at what kinds of investments do we need to make, and in what kinds of areas to really create resilient communities. And so that's really what we're going to be focused on. How do we create more resilient communities? How do we bring everybody into a strong new economy future?
Oh, go ahead. I think you're muted, Suzanne. Sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to add a quick thing to what Peggy was saying and give a couple examples just quickly. One is great organization out of New York called Block Power, run by a friend. They're doing great. They're transitioning urban housing, a lot of public housing, into they're enabling the transition into being powered by solar, wind, et cetera, renewable in urban neighborhoods, public housing in particular. And they're using local residents to do that. So I just love the connection between the transition from buildings and using local workforces. And the second thing is, I was talking to former Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, fantastic guy, doing a lot of work on green jobs as well. We were brainstorming on the job categories he was working on, and I said, "What about carbon accountants?" Like, I sit in the corporate sector. We have 1,000 companies that have taken net zero commitments in the last year, and very few people know how to do carbon accounting. It's gonna be an exploding field. So, and the digital transformation that's going to be required for energy companies, manufacturers, retailers. I think there's, just thinking about it, And, Habitat's doing great work installing solar. Danelle's doing great work in creating communities that are transitioning in their own buildings. But we also have to step up and think a little bigger and broader about there's all kinds of digital skills that I'm seeing from my vantage point that are really, really needed. And we just have a real lack of training programs and talent there. So excited to do more there.
And I totally agree. Block Power is a wonderful organization, and at WEACT in Harlem, we are also doing solar installations on public housing and on low-income tenant-owned cooperatives, because again, that's a way to reduce those energy bills and keep housing affordable. And then again, training underemployed folks in our community to do those solar installations in their own community and being part of that solution. We've even had some of our trainees come together and form their own worker association, and they're now bidding on jobs and beginning to be independent and being able to share in those profits. So there's so many ways we can begin to think about access to this new economy and how workers can really share in it.
Well, and I think that solar installation is actually quite an interesting example of what we're talking about here, because it's a job growth category, it's a retraining opportunity, but it's also a real opportunity for the government at all levels to support the development of this new economy by offering incentives for installation to homeowners, incentives for companies that are retraining workers. And so, Brandon, I'm just kind of curious, like in your community, what is the rate of solar penetration like, and what do you think would help that along?
It's a lot lower than it needs to be. Our regulatory environment is not good right now. We do have net metering, so for homeowners, it's fairly viable. But we have.
Can you just define net metering real quickly for people?
Oh gosh, I'm probably not the best. Basically, you can generate extra power and put it back into the system, and the utility will recognize that on your bill. So you can tie it into the existing system. Our existing power system, it's a state-backed monopoly, and it largely, it's controlled. It ties into the coal system. It's a state monopoly built on coal and power generated by coal. Utility scale solar, commercial solar, environmentally it's possible. Our former mountaintop removal sites, these are flat areas up high. They're rural, but a lot of times they are near utilities because they used to be an active mine land. It could be a phenomenal source of solar energy to put solar farms on these former mine lands. But our regulatory environment currently does not really allow utility scale solar because we have a monopoly system. So there are very large scale policy changes that are going to happen to truly unleash the solar industry here in our state. What's amazing, despite a tough regulatory environment, we have started a new solar company in West Virginia. It's run by a fellow named Dan Conant. It's called Solar Holler. It employs more than 50 people. These are union jobs with the Electrical Brotherhood of Electricians, and rooftop solar for homeowners it's grown. It's more than doubled the size of its business year over year for the last 3 to 4 years. So the demand is there, but we've got to loosen up the regulations to truly unleash the power of the solar sector.
Well, this has been such a fantastic conversation. I thank you all so much for joining us, and to you in the audience, thank you so much for joining us at Bloomberg at the Sustainable Business Summit. Any concluding comments? We have about 40 seconds left on the clock, so I don't want to run on too long.
Well, I would just say that Jennifer Granholm, the Secretary of Energy, came and did a visit to a number of communities, but also in Harlem, and she really wanted to understand the challenges and regulatory obstacles. to really addressing solar and other kinds of energy changes. So I think the administration is beginning to really look at that. What are those challenges and obstacles that we need to overcome in terms of regulation to ensure that we can have the energy future we all need?